When people talk about Chicago's street raising projects in the 1870s, they almost always focus on the spectacle above ground. They talk about the city hoisting entire buildings into the air on jack screws. They talk about engineers lifting blocks of architecture as if gravity itself had become negotiable. They talk about the new elevated streets, the improved drainage, the promise of cleaner roads, and a more modern future. It's usually framed as one of those classic American stories, practical, ambitious, triumphant. A city with mud in its boots, deciding to reinvent itself by sheer force of will. And that version of the story is not exactly wrong. Chicago really did raise its streets. It really did struggle with flooding sewage and the constant misery of building a major city on low, wet ground. Civic leaders really were trying to solve a serious public health problem while preparing Chicago for the kind of explosive growth they believed was coming. In the official telling, it was a smart engineering response to a dirty urban reality. Raise the grade, install proper drainage, modernize the city, move forward. But that is only the story people were meant to see. Because the moment workers began cutting beneath the old street level, another story started surfacing. Not publicly, not loudly, not in the triumphant newspaper language of progress and improvement. This story unfolded in work notes, internal observations, photographs that never became famous, and scattered comments that later slipped into archival margins. It was quieter than the celebration above, more inconvenient too, and it began with something that should have been routine. The engineers were supposed to determine how the ground beneath downtown Chicago would support the new street system and the foundations that came with it. That meant excavation. That meant measuring, clearing, digging, inspecting. And as soon as they started opening the earth beneath the old grade, they ran into layers that no one seemed prepared to explain. At first, maybe that did not feel unusual. Any growing city has buried debris. Any place that builds quickly leaves behind scraps, fill rubble, rotted lumber, old foundations, forgotten cellars. That was probably the assumption. Chicago had grown fast after all, fast enough to blur its own beginnings. So when crews started finding remnants beneath the streets, the easiest explanation was the obvious one. Old construction, earlier grades, settler mess, nothing more. But the deeper they went, the less convincing that explanation became. What appeared below the muddy streets was not just random debris from a young frontier city improvising its way toward modernity. Workers found structural remains that seemed too substantial, too carefully made, and too deeply buried to fit comfortably within Chicago's official early timeline. Instead of a chaotic scatter of rough remains, they found something with pattern and permanence. Surfaces, walls, foundations, architectural details that did not look like temporary solutions thrown together by settlers on unstable ground. Some of it looked refined, some of it looked deliberate, some of it looked older than it was supposed to be. And one phrase kept turning up in internal records of the time, or at least in the surviving fragments that later researchers would piece together: pre-existing construction, unexpected preservation, origin uncertain. That is not the kind of wording you use when you are dealing with ordinary rubble. The official story that developed later would smooth all of this over. It would reduce these discoveries to the harmless remains of earlier buildings, abandoned basements, or accumulated layers from rapid urban growth. A muddy city gets muddier. Streets rise. Old lower levels become buried. End of story. Clean, simple, digestible. But when you look at what little visual evidence remains from that era, especially the excavation photographs that survived outside the main public narrative, the neat explanation starts to wobble. Those images do not show a few harmless scraps of frontier Chicago. They show workers standing beside buried architectural features that look far more complete than they should. They show stone foundations cut with a level of precision that feels out of step with the rough and ready image of an early trading post. They show lower stories of buildings sitting below the later street grade as if entire structures had been swallowed. Doorways, window openings, walls preserved in place, not scattered remains, not wreckage, not the half-rotted leftovers of a town that simply kept building upward in a messy rush. What they suggest instead is burial. And not just any burial, a rapid one. That was one of the details that quietly troubled even the more conventional observers on site. If buildings are gradually abandoned, demolished, or covered over by years of incremental street fill, you expect irregularity. You expect one property line to differ from the next. One structure half preserved, another nearly gone. One block to sit deeper, another shallower. You expect a city's buried remains to reflect the disorder of time, ownership, weather, and human use. But in parts of Chicago's downtown excavation zones, the buried levels appeared with unsettling consistency. Structures separated by blocks seemed to sit at nearly the same depth. Window heights aligned. Door frames appeared in relation to one another with a kind of uniform logic that did not feel accidental. That is the sort of pattern people try not to overinterpret. Engineers especially. Their instinct is usually to simplify, not speculate. So the first attempts to explain what they were seeing stayed grounded in the practical. Poor drainage, settling, repeated grading, years of mud, a swampy city doing swampy city things. But as more buried structures came to light, those explanations had to do more and more work. Because why were some of these foundations built for permanence instead of convenience? Why did certain structural elements look overbuilt for a rough frontier town that supposedly rose almost overnight? Why were some lower levels preserved with such completeness as if sealed away, rather than slowly consumed by damp rot and time? And maybe most unsettling of all, why did so much of it seem to belong to the same buried horizon? That last point matters. A lot. Because if different buildings from different years all wind up resting beneath the same blanket of fill, the obvious implication is that whatever covered them did not happen in a slow, casual drift. It happened broadly, it happened decisively, it happened to a district, not just to a single neglected lot. The engineering teams may not have used dramatic language for that realization. You do not usually find phrases like catastrophic burial written plainly into practical city paperwork. But the concern still shows through in softer language, in hesitations, in evasive descriptions. You can almost feel the discomfort behind the wording. Something down there did not line up with the story of Chicago as a messy young city simply cleaning itself up. And as that discomfort grew, the documentation seems to have narrowed. Descriptions became vaguer, reports became shorter, photographs stopped showing the most revealing details. Areas that had been opened were measured, noted just enough to satisfy procedure and then covered again as the work advanced. By 1874, new foundations and elevated street systems were locking much of it back into darkness. Whatever had been exposed beneath sections of the city was not explored like a major archaeological revelation. It was treated like an obstacle to be passed through quickly. That silence is one of the strangest parts of the whole story. Because if what the crews found were simply ordinary remnants of early Chicago, then why not describe them fully? Why not present them as fascinating engineering encounters with the city's recent past? Why not preserve the clearest examples? Why do the most intriguing photographs survive in scattered places instead of sitting proudly in well-known civic collections? Maybe there are mundane answers to all of that. Maybe bureaucracy deadlines and limited historical imagination explain more than conspiracy ever could. That is possible. But even with the most cautious reading, a pattern begins to emerge from the fragments that remain. Buildings that seem too well made for the standard frontier narrative. Preservation too complete for slow burial. Architecture that feels inherited rather than improvised. Infrastructure that hints at an urban environment more established than the one official history prefers to remember. And that is where the real unease begins, because once you accept that the excavations beneath 1870s Chicago may have revealed more than a few buried basements, the whole story shifts. The street raising project stops looking like a simple act of civic modernization. It starts to look like something else too, not just an elevation, but a ceiling. Not just a construction project, but the closing of a lid over something older, stranger, and far less convenient than the city's official beginning. Once the crews moved beyond the first expected bands of mud and broken material, the pattern became harder to dismiss as ordinary urban build-up. They had gone into the job expecting confusion, yes, but a familiar kind of confusion. In a fast-growing 19th century city, buried remnants should look messy, improvised, uneven. One owner feels a lot differently than another. One street is graded higher, one building gets demolished, another repurposed, another simply left to rot below newer construction. That is how a young city normally leaves its traces behind, in fragments, in inconsistencies, in layers that reflect human disorder. But what the workers were finding beneath parts of downtown Chicago did not behave like disorder. Again and again, from one section to the next, the excavations exposed buried architectural levels sitting at roughly the same depth. That might not sound dramatic at first. A few feet here, a few feet there may be the result of later grading. But the more locations that revealed the same relationship between the newer street level and the older structural remains, the stranger it became. Storefronts aligned across adjacent blocks, doorways sat at matching depths. Window heights repeated with a kind of consistency that implied a shared event rather than a slow, uneven process. And that matters because cities usually do not bury themselves with that kind of neatness. Natural accumulation is erratic. Mud washes differently down different roads. Debris gathers in some places and not others. Owners modify buildings independently. Fires, repairs, collapses, and drainage problems create irregular layers. Over time, the buried landscape of a city should look lopsided and patchwork. But in parts of the loop, the buried levels suggested a district that had been covered in a far more uniform way, almost as if an entire older urban surface had vanished beneath a common blanket. That observation did not immediately produce some bold alternate theory. No one on the engineering crews was trying to write revisionist history. They were trying to finish a job. Their instinct was still to reduce every anomaly to something practical. Regrading, repeated mud build-up, earlier attempts at levelling, the cumulative nonsense of a city growing faster than its records. But the more structural remains that appeared, the more those explanations began to strain. Because the second anomaly was not just depth, it was quality. Under the expected layers of fill, workers began encountering stone and brickwork that seemed far more sophisticated than Chicago's accepted early image would prepare you for. This was not the rough makeshift construction you associate with a muddy frontier settlement racing toward legitimacy. Some of the masonry was precise. Some of the foundations looked engineered for real longevity. Not temporary, not provisional, not the kind of thing you build when you expect a place to remain a half-formed outpost for a few years before replacing everything later. There were brick facades with consistent coursing, stone lintels shaped with more intention than necessity demanded. Framed entrances that suggested design, not just function. Even the proportions of certain buried commercial fronts hinted at an established urban style rather than the architectural equivalent of improvisation. For a city that officially liked to imagine its earlier self as rough, muddy, and barely coherent, these buried details felt oddly polished. And there is the uncomfortable question buried inside that observation. If frontier Chicago was as crude and short-lived in its earliest phase as the standard story suggests, then why do some of these buried remains look like they belong to a more settled and confident city? Why do they suggest experience, tradition and permanence? You can try to explain that away by saying skilled builders arrived earlier than expected. You can say some owners had more money, more ambition, better materials. You can say history compresses things and that the line between rough settlement and real city was blurrier than later textbooks admit. All of that is fair. But even with those explanations, something about the excavated layers still feels off. Not impossible, just off. Then came the issue of preservation. That may be the part that unsettled the workers most, because deterioration follows patterns too. Buildings left to decline gradually in a wet environment do not normally hold themselves together with serene patience. Wood rots, frames warp, glass breaks, hardware corrodes, interiors collapse in stages, waterworks unevenly and relentlessly, yet some of the buried lower levels exposed during the street raising project seemed sealed rather than decayed, protected rather than eroded. In a few accounts and surviving descriptions, workers entered spaces that felt less like ruins and more like rooms interrupted. Walls still stood, door frames remained in place. Windows appeared sealed in ways that suggested the mud around them had acted almost like a preservative layer. Certain wooden elements reportedly survived better than anyone would expect from structures left to slow neglect. And this is where the whole thing starts to feel genuinely eerie, because gradual burial leaves a different signature than sudden coverage. One produces disorder, the other can produce suspension. Some lower areas gave the impression of buildings that had not been dismantled piece by piece or abandoned through a long process of decline, but overwhelmed and sealed in a shorter event. Not necessarily overnight, not necessarily by some theatrical disaster, but not by casual urban drift either. That distinction is everything. Because if these spaces were buried more quickly than official history accounts for, then what did the burying? Chicago certainly had mud. Chicago certainly had drainage problems. Chicago certainly had the sort of primitive early conditions that later generations loved to mock. But mud alone does not explain why large sections of structural remains appear at a shared depth with a level of preservation that implies enclosure rather than slow decomposition. The official explanation could cover pieces of the evidence, maybe even much of it, but not all of it comfortably at once. And yet publicly the story never expanded to match the strangeness of the finds. That silence becomes more obvious the longer you sit with it. The excavation photographs that survive show enough to raise questions, but the official records often glide right past the most visually significant discoveries. New grades, new foundations, new engineering work. Those details get careful treatment. What lay beneath is reduced to phrases like old construction or prior street level, as though workers had merely brushed past a few harmless leftovers on the way to progress. There is a weird disproportion there. The visual evidence appears more intriguing than the written summaries want it to be. If the buried structures were ordinary, why minimize them? If they were historically unimportant, why do the photographs feel more revealing than the reports? If they were just earlier building levels from a rapidly evolving young city, why does the language around them become so flat and evasive? You do not have to assume an organized cover-up to notice that the narrative narrows right where curiosity should widen. Sometimes institutions do that naturally. Sometimes complicated things get simplified because no one has time, money, or appetite for ambiguity. Sometimes people engaged in one kind of work, in this case engineering, have no interest in opening an entirely different category of problem, especially one that threatens to derail schedules and budgets. But whatever the reason, the result is the same. A strange buried landscape briefly appears, gets noted just enough to avoid complete denial, and then disappears beneath the cleaner story of civic advancement. And the deeper some crews went, the stranger the buried city began to feel. Commercial spaces were among the most revealing finds. These were not always the flimsy wooden fronts you might expect from a boom town throwing itself together in haste. Some appeared to be long-term storefronts built with the assumption that they would serve a stable urban public for years, maybe decades. Their proportions, materials, and surviving details did not scream temporary. They suggested investment, continuity, confidence. In some accounts, painted signage remained visible. In others, display windows or lower-level openings survived in startling condition. That detail is easy to miss, but it changes the emotional texture of the whole excavation. A buried wall is one thing. A buried storefront is something else. A storefront implies commerce routine, foot traffic, daily life. It implies a district, not just a structure. It implies people passing by windows, stopping at doors, entering and leaving a settled streetscape. When workers found those spaces below the later city, they were not just uncovering foundations, they were uncovering traces of an urban rhythm that had somehow ended beneath the surface. And then there were the passages. This is one of the most persistent and puzzling threads in the private descriptions. Officially, the famous freight tunnel systems people associate with Chicago belong to a later period. But during the street raising era, workers repeatedly ran into below-grade corridors and connecting spaces that seemed older than the official timeline for that infrastructure would suggest. Some were narrow and ambiguous enough to dismiss as service basements or linked storage areas, but others sounded more substantial, purposeful, engineered. A frontier town built on unstable, wet ground is not the place where you would expect sophisticated subgrade connections to appear casually and repeatedly. Not unless someone had planned for them, not unless the city beneath the city was more organized than the official story allows. That is the possibility that hovers over the whole episode. Not proof, not certainty, but possibility. The Chicago that modern history celebrates as a young city, rising with astonishing speed, may not have emerged on a blank slate at all. It may have risen over something earlier, something more complete, something that had already solved problems of commerce, circulation and permanence before the 19th century narrative officially begins. And once that possibility enters the frame even cautiously, the street raising project stops feeling like a simple modernization effort. It becomes an accidental exposure. A moment when the city opened its own ground and glimpsed an older version of itself, or perhaps an older city entirely, only to cover it again before the implications could spread too far. The deeper the excavations pushed into Chicago's downtown ground, the more one detail kept returning with quiet insistence. It was not just that old structures existed below the newer street grade. That alone could be explained away. Almost any old city contains forgotten basements, buried foundations, and remnants of earlier building phases. What made the Chicago discoveries so unsettling was the character of the material that covered them. In some places, the fill looked exactly like what later historians would want it to be: broken debris, mixed dirt, rubble consistent with demolition rebuilding, and all the ordinary chaos that comes with a city growing too fast for its own plans. Those areas fit the standard narrative nicely. A muddy town improves itself. Streets rise a little at a time. Old levels get swallowed, nothing mysterious about it. But other sections did not look accidental at all. Workers described zones where the fill seemed dense, clean, and strangely consistent. Not the random jumble of years of urban neglect, but compacted material that felt placed rather than drifted. Packed as if someone had made a decision. As if the old level had not simply disappeared beneath time, but had been intentionally covered to create a new one. That distinction is easy to miss unless you stop and think about how cities usually bury things. Natural accumulation is sloppy. Deliberate fill is organized. One meanders, the other obeys a purpose. And beneath parts of Chicago, the coverage seemed purposeful. That did not mean every foot of earth told the same story. The buried district was not some perfect hidden map waiting to be uncovered intact. There were irregularities, mixed layers, damaged areas, and all the confusion you would expect in any real excavation. but enough of the pattern repeated that even cautious observers had reason to hesitate. The fill in some places did not look like a city that had gradually buried itself. It looked like a city that had been covered. This is where the official explanation starts to feel less like a complete answer and more like a blanket laid over multiple problems at once. Poor drainage, street mud, hasty early grading, swampy terrain, repeated rebuilding. All of those things are true enough in isolation. Chicago did suffer from dreadful conditions in its early years, but those facts do not automatically explain why so many buried architectural features appear under a fairly uniform horizon, or why some of the material above them seems more like placed fill than accumulated ruin. And the more complete the buried structures became, the more awkward the silence around them grew. Some of the most intact lower-level spaces were reportedly photographed once and then sealed back beneath new construction. Some areas where the architectural details appeared most refined were closed off quickly in the name of efficiency. Officially, that was not suspicious. Street raising was expensive, disruptive, and urgent. Delays cost money. Construction crews are not archaeological societies. Their job was to build the future, not linger over the past. That explanation has weight. It would be unreasonable to expect 19th century engineers to halt a major public works project every time they found something historically interesting. But even so, the pattern is hard to ignore. The areas most likely to provoke larger questions seem to have been the ones least fully explored. The better built structures, the more complete storefronts, the deeper sections with unexpectedly sophisticated details, the passages that hinted at prior infrastructure. Those are the places where documentation thins and coverage resumes, not always not perfectly, but often enough to make the rhythm visible. Brief exposure, minimal notation, rapid sealing. If all of it truly fit within Chicago's accepted developmental story, then you would expect more confidence in describing it. More specificity, not less. More pride in the city's layered past, not a retreat into vague language. Yet in many of the surviving accounts, what lies beneath the official street grade is treated almost like a nuisance, a complication better managed than examined. And maybe that is because examination would have forced an uncomfortable possibility into the open. Not proof, but possibility. The possibility that modern Chicago was not simply built upward from a muddy frontier settlement, but built over an earlier urban landscape whose existence later narratives compressed, minimized, or failed to understand. A landscape substantial enough to leave aligned commercial fronts, engineered foundations, buried passages, and preserved lower stories beneath the city's celebrated modernization project. That idea becomes harder to shake when you consider the foundations themselves. For a city supposedly thrown together in haste, some of the deeper structural work uncovered in the excavations seem remarkably committed to permanence. These were not always shallow footings, resting nervously on marshy ground. In some locations, the foundations extended to depths that suggested long-term expectation. Builders who invest in that kind of support are not thinking in purely temporary terms. They are building for durability, for weight, for continuity. They are assuming the structure above deserves to stand and that the environment below can be mastered. That level of confidence does not pair neatly with the myth of crude, short-lived frontier improvisation. You can argue that ambitious early builders simply overbuilt when they could. You can argue that parts of Chicago urbanized faster and more skillfully than later simplified histories admit. That may be true, but once again the issue is accumulation. One anomaly can be dismissed. Two can be contextualized. But when burial depth preservation, fill pattern construction quality, and below-grade passages all start tugging in the same direction, the official story begins to feel less stable. And all of this unfolded in a city already obsessed with reinvention. That matters too. Chicago in the 1870s was not a place in the mood for philosophical uncertainty about its own buried past. It was a city looking forward with almost aggressive determination. It had endured disaster, mud disease, fire and ridicule. It was rebuilding itself physically and symbolically. It wanted to be modern, rational, elevated, clean. It wanted to present itself as a triumph of engineering and civic will. In that environment, awkward evidence that complicated the origin story had no obvious place. The public narrative needed momentum. Buried contradictions were not useful. So the streets rose. Foundations were reset. New grades took over. Sidewalks and commercial fronts adjusted to the higher urban surface. Beneath that clean narrative of progress, older levels were left in darkness. Whatever workers had stepped into below the city was not erased exactly, but entombed a second time, this time beneath official improvement. And the surviving fragments only make the mystery sharper. A few photographs, a handful of notes, private letters and scattered observations. Enough to suggest that what was found beneath Chicago was more coherent than later accounts admit, but not enough to reconstruct the whole buried district with certainty. That gap is important. It creates room for exaggeration, yes, but also room for real unanswered questions. The absence of full documentation does not automatically mean nothing significant was there. Sometimes it means the opposite. Sometimes it means something appeared briefly and vanished before anyone with the right tools or curiosity was invited to stay with it. That may be the most haunting part of the story. Not that a buried city definitely existed in the strongest possible sense, but that the street raising project may have revealed a version of Chicago's past that was never allowed to become fully visible. A chapter glimpsed through construction trenches and wet masonry, then sealed beneath the practical language of progress. And when you look at the completion of the 1874 work, the project begins to read differently. It was not only an elevation, it was a closure. The city solved its drainage problem, yes. It modernized its streets, yes. But in doing so, it also fixed a new official surface over whatever older urban reality had briefly emerged below. By the end of the project, the public had a cleaner city and a simpler story. Chicago had lifted itself. Chicago had modernized. Chicago had conquered mud. But under that polished version, another possibility remained buried. A possibility that the most troubling discoveries were not lost by accident, but absorbed by a system that preferred continuity over confusion. A possibility that what lay under the loop was not just evidence of poor planning, but evidence of a previous urban order, one suddenly interrupted, then covered so completely that within a generation it could be dismissed as nothing more than old cellars and forgotten grade changes. And if that happened once, even in part, then the question expands beyond Chicago. Because cities are very good at building over what they do not know how to explain. That is the larger unease buried inside the Chicago story. Not just whether one city concealed an older layer of itself, but whether urban history by its very nature is full of these moments. Moments where construction outruns curiosity. Where engineering solves a practical problem while unintentionally sealing away a historical one. Where what gets covered becomes easier to simplify than to understand. Chicago is especially compelling because the timing is so strange. The discoveries surfaced during a period of intense civic transformation when the city had every reason to emphasize progress and very little incentive to dwell on anomalies. The street raising project was a public spectacle. It symbolized competence, modernization and control. Entire blocks were lifted. New grades were established. Commercial life adapted. It was exactly the kind of story newspapers love, dramatic but productive, disruptive but triumphant. A young American city proving its ingenuity to itself and to the country. And beneath that celebration, workers were running into something that did not fit the script. Not just buried basements, not just abandoned lower levels, but repeated signs of a prior urban surface that seemed too organized, too complete, and in places too sophisticated to sit comfortably inside the standard frontier timeline. The deeper they dug, the less this looked like accidental residue and the more it looked like a covered layer of city. That is why the preserved interiors matter so much. A ruined wall can be rationalized, a sunken foundation can be ignored. But when buried spaces retain the feeling of interruption, when they appear less decayed than sealed, the emotional logic changes. Suddenly you are no longer imagining gradual neglect. You are imagining stoppage, a district whose life ended below the grade line, a streetscape that continued to exist physically even after the city above it moved on. That is much harder to fold into a casual narrative of mud and rebuilding. Some of the descriptions from the time, sparse though they are, carry exactly that feeling. Workers entering lower spaces that seem suspended. Commercial rooms that did not read like ruins in the usual sense, but like places abruptly left behind. Structural details surviving under pressure and filled with more coherence than prolonged exposure should have allowed. Those observations are not proof of a single dramatic event by themselves, but they do keep pointing toward the same unsettling possibility. Chicago's buried levels were not all created by slow, uneven accumulation. At least some of them may have resulted from a broader and faster covering process than official history ever cared to describe. Then there is the issue of chronology. This may be the most dangerous part of the whole subject, because once chronology starts to wobble, every comfortable summary has to work harder. If the structures beneath Chicago showed an urban sophistication that should not have existed that early, then one of two things has to give. Either the official timeline is oversimplified to the point of distortion, or the buried architecture belonged to something older and more developed than later generations understood. Neither option sits easily inside a clean civic origin story. And that may explain why the most refined finds seem to recede so quickly from the record. There are recurring mentions in later interpretations of workers being told to move on to stop lingering to prioritize the engineering schedule over detailed documentation. Again, that can sound sinister when repeated too dramatically, but it does not need drama to be meaningful. Even ordinary institutional behavior can function like suppression when the result is the same. If the most confusing discoveries are the ones least fully documented, then history inherits silence instead of clarity. And silence over time hardens into absence. Future generations look back and find only fragments. The official story survives not because it answered every question, but because competing evidence was never given room to solidify. That is exactly what seems to have happened here. By the time the elevated streets were in place and the work was complete, Chicago had effectively rewritten its own surface. The older levels did not vanish, but they became inaccessible physically and narratively. What had been glimpsed in trenches and excavation cuts was now under new roads, new sidewalks, new commercial fronts, new assumptions. A modern city stood above and below it sat a buried puzzle that no longer fit the version of history being told. And the surviving photographs only deepen that tension. In those images, workers stand inside or beside structures that look far too substantial to be dismissed as random frontier leftovers. You can see walls retaining their shape, openings that clearly once served as entrances or windows, masonry that implies design, not desperation. The photographs do not explain themselves, and that is part of what makes them so powerful. They simply show enough to make the official reduction feel incomplete. Enough to make you ask why a supposedly young, rough city had so much coherent architecture sitting below the later grade. The tunnel question only adds to that feeling. Chicago is famous for its later subsurface systems, but the descriptions attached to the 1870s excavations suggest that workers encountered passages and connections below the accepted timeline for that infrastructure. Some might have been service corridors, some might have been linked cellar spaces. That is true, but even those more modest interpretations carry implications. Linked below grade spaces require planning. They require an urban logic. They imply a district built to function in coordinated ways, not just a row of isolated frontier structures thrown up in haste. Once you start adding that to everything else, to the fill patterns, the preservation, the aligned storefronts, the refined masonry, the deep foundations, the silence in the reports, the sealed excavation zones, the sense of interruption in the buried interiors, you begin to see why this story refuses to disappear. It is not because every mystery claim attached to it is automatically true. It is because the underlying evidence keeps suggesting that something about Chicago's buried past is more complex than the official narrative allows. And complexity is exactly what public memory tends to resist. Cities like clean myths. They like founding stories that move in a straight line from hardship to greatness. Chicago's preferred myth is almost perfect in that sense. A muddy little place on difficult ground becomes a titan through grit, engineering, and ambition. It is practical, inspiring, and distinctly American. What that myth does not have room for is the possibility that a more substantial city or a more substantial urban layer was already there, in ways later narratives flattened or forgot. Because if that were true, then Chicago did not simply rise. It inherited, it covered, it absorbed. The city above would still be real. The achievement would still be real, but the story would no longer begin where it claims to begin. And that is why the 1874 street raising project feels in retrospect like a threshold moment. For a brief period, Chicago opened its own ground and exposed evidence that could have complicated its entire self-understanding. Workers saw it. Notes recorded parts of it. Cameras caught glimpses. Then the project advanced, the grade rose, and the old level slipped back out of reach. What remains is not a solved case, but a pattern. A pattern of sophisticated buried architecture. A pattern of uniform burial depth across multiple areas. A pattern of preserved lower levels that feel sealed rather than slowly ruined. A pattern of below-grade infrastructure that seems older than it should. A pattern of documentation that narrows right where the implications widen. And once you see that pattern, the final stage of the project looks different. It no longer feels like the end of a civic improvement campaign. It feels like the final act of concealment, whether intentional or incidental. The new city did not just stand above the old one, it pressed it down into silence. And once you frame it that way, the last question becomes impossible to avoid. Why were the most troublesome discoveries the ones that vanished fastest? That is where this story stops feeling like a quirky footnote in urban engineering and starts pressing against the edge of historical discomfort. Because one buried cellar is forgettable. A few old walls below a raised street can be absorbed into the standard narrative with barely any strain. But a repeating pattern of sophisticated buried structures aligned across districts, preserved below a common layer linked to passages and deep foundations that is different. That forces a city to either widen its history or narrow its evidence. Chicago, at least in practice, seems to have chosen the second option. Not necessarily through some grand theatrical conspiracy, that is important to say. History does not always hide things with villainous intent. Sometimes it hides them through bureaucracy, urgency, embarrassment, and the practical habits of institutions that do not want complicated problems. If engineers were under pressure to finish the street raising quickly, then anything that slowed the work would naturally be treated as an inconvenience. If civic leaders wanted a story of progress, they would not be eager to spotlight discoveries that introduced chronological confusion. If newspapers were celebrating technological triumph, they were hardly going to pause and ask whether the city being elevated might itself have been sitting on top of a forgotten urban layer. That is how concealment often works in the real world, not as a dramatic secret meeting in a candlelit room, but as a series of practical decisions that all lean in the same direction. Document less, fill faster, move on, preserve the schedule, keep the public story simple. And in Chicago, that simplicity had real value. The city had every reason to control its narrative. It had grown explosively. It had suffered catastrophic fire. It had endured mockery for its mud, its smell, its instability, and its chaos. The street raising project was a chance to replace all of that with a cleaner identity, a city of confidence, of engineering, of upward motion. You can see why a buried chapter that complicated the origin story would have been unwelcome. It did not serve the new image. It did not support the myth of a raw frontier settlement transforming itself through sheer modern determination. It suggested the ground beneath the city already carried a history that did not fit. And if that suggestion had been explored fully, it might have led somewhere no one wanted to go. Because think about what the buried structures implied if taken seriously. Not just isolated buildings, but a district. Not just remnants, but an urban system. Storefronts, passages, aligned elevations, durable foundations, refined architectural details. These are not the fingerprints of randomness. They are the signs of planning continuity and civic life. They suggest that what lay below the later streets was not merely the awkward first draft of Chicago, but something more coherent than that. Potentially older, potentially more advanced than the compressed public timeline would allow. And that would destabilize more than a local story. It would unsettle the broader American habit of imagining the Midwest as if urban sophistication appeared there almost overnight, summoned by railroads, commerce, and ambition alone. If Chicago's subgrade exposed evidence of a more established urban environment than officially acknowledged, then the city's history would no longer begin cleanly with the version taught in simplified civic memory. It would have a buried preface, one that raised uncomfortable questions about who built what when and what happened to it. That is exactly the sort of problem cities prefer to pave over. The surviving worker testimony, limited though it is, gives the whole story its most human edge. These were not historians trying to invent mysteries. They were men on a job, encountering things beneath their feet that did not behave the way ordinary buried remains should. In scattered recollections and correspondence, you can feel that mixture of practicality and unease. They describe intact spaces, unexpected passages, construction that seemed too substantial for the accepted early period, areas that felt less discovered than re-entered. That distinction matters. To discover a ruin is one thing. To feel as if you have stepped back into a sealed part of a functioning city is something else entirely. And then almost always those spaces disappear from the story. They are photographed once maybe, noted briefly, then covered. That rhythm repeats so often that it starts to feel like the central fact of the entire episode. The mystery is not only what was found, the mystery is how quickly what was found stopped being discussable. Even the language used afterward reflects that retreat. Rather than clear descriptions of buried districts or earlier urban layers, later summaries prefer phrases that flatten the discoveries into harmless technicalities. Previous grade, old construction, cellar remains, fill complications. The vocabulary itself acts like a lid. It reduces, it domesticates, it takes material that may have been historically disruptive and makes it sound dull enough to ignore. That is why the photographs are so important. They resist reduction. Whatever else they do not prove, they show enough to puncture the softness of the official wording. They show real structural coherence below the raised streets. They show walls openings and masonry at depths that prompt obvious questions. They show workers standing where a later city should not have had such complete architectural memory preserved beneath it, at least not if the standard story were fully sufficient. In a way, those images are the surviving argument. The buried city does not need to be announced dramatically because the visual evidence already whispers it. Something was down there, something substantial, something that looked less like residue and more like inheritance. And that inheritance appears to have been handled not as a revelation but as a liability. This is where the notion of a catastrophic burial enters the conversation, though it should be handled carefully. The surviving evidence does not let you declare with certainty that some single dramatic event swallowed downtown Chicago whole. That would go beyond what the material can safely support, but the pattern does allow a more cautious conclusion. At minimum, parts of the buried district appear to have been covered more rapidly and systematically than the usual explanation of slow accumulation makes comfortable. Whether that happened through deliberate fill after a destructive event, through a large-scale urban intervention whose details were later blurred, or through some combination of disaster and redesign, the result seems similar. An older level of city life ended, was covered, and then ceased to matter publicly except as a construction inconvenience. And maybe that is the most revealing part of all. Not the possibility that Chicago once hid an older city below its streets, but the possibility that people in 1874 briefly saw evidence of that and chose usefulness over curiosity. They did not stop to investigate the older layer because the newer one had to be built. They did not preserve the full puzzle because the road, the sidewalk, the grade, the schedule, and the public story all demanded completion. The city needed to rise, so the questions had to go down. By the time the work was done, modern Chicago had the surface it wanted. Elevated streets, improved drainage, a fresh narrative of resilience and ingenuity. Beneath that surface sat another possibility entirely, one never fully disproved because it was never fully explored. A buried urban layer, a hidden chronology, a city under the city. And once you accept that Chicago may have sealed away evidence of an older and stranger past, during one of its proudest engineering achievements, it becomes very difficult not to wonder where else the same thing happened. Because if Chicago did it, whether intentionally or simply through the momentum of urban development, then Chicago may not be unusual at all. It may just be one of the rare cases where the process became visible long enough for traces to survive. That is what gives this story its lasting pull. It is not only about one American city and its buried lower levels. It is about a possibility that extends far beyond the Midwest. The possibility that modern cities are often built over histories they never truly examined, and that what gets sealed beneath them is not always random debris. Sometimes it may be evidence of earlier worlds that were inconvenient, confusing, or simply too expensive to investigate when they briefly came back into view. Urban growth is almost designed to erase curiosity. A trench opens, something strange appears. Decisions must be made quickly, and the future always has contractors waiting. That is how a mystery becomes fill. That is how a buried district becomes a technical note. That is how a whole layer of civic memory can be pushed below the threshold of public awareness in a single construction season. And Chicago offers an unusually vivid example because the contradiction is sitting right in the center of the city's own origin myth. Officially, Chicago was a muddy settlement that rose with astonishing speed through commerce, rail connections, engineering, and relentless ambition. That story has enough truth in it to endure. But if the 1874 excavations exposed architecture that looked more established than the timeline should allow, then the myth is missing a chapter, not necessarily replacing the known story, but preceding it. Underneath the famous rise of Chicago may have been a quieter story of inheritance, burial, and reuse. That possibility lingers most strongly in the surviving visual record. Look closely at the workers in those excavation photographs standing below later grade lines, framed by masonry and openings that should not feel so composed if they were merely staring at random remnants. The structures around them look like places, not fragments. They look like parts of a functional streetscape. Even when damaged, they still carry the geometry of ordinary life. A door where people once entered. A window where goods or light once passed. A wall that belonged to a room, not just a ruin. Those details matter because they humanize the buried layer. They remind you that whatever lay below Chicago was once used, walked through, depended on, arranged, and then it was gone from public memory. That loss becomes even stranger when you consider how modern Chicago later embraced underground systems of its own. Freight tunnels, service corridors, layered infrastructure, all of that became part of the city's accepted complexity in later decades. Chicago has no trouble acknowledging that it became a city with depth, but the deeper, older depth hinted at during the street raising remains marginal, almost unwanted. The official history is comfortable with the subterranean once the subterranean fits the approved timeline. It is much less comfortable when below-ground complexity appears too early, suggesting organization before the city is supposed to have had it. That tension may explain why the tunnel reports from the 1870s are so provocative. Even if some of those passages were smaller and more mundane than later speculation claims, they still suggest coordinated below-grade planning. And planning is the enemy of the simplest frontier narrative. A truly rough temporary settlement improvises. It does not usually produce elegant alignments of buried commercial fronts, deep permanent foundations, and linked lower-level spaces that feel like inherited infrastructure. Those are signs of continuity, signs of a place that already knew itself as a city. There is also something revealing in how often later explanations rely on the word frontier as though it solves everything by itself. Frontier can mean rough, it can mean temporary, it can mean underdocumented, it can mean chaotic, but it can also become a blanket term that excuses anomalies instead of addressing them. If something looks too refined, it gets folded into the frontier anyway. If something appears too deeply buried, the frontier mud did it. If preservation seems too complete, rapid early growth explains it. The word becomes a kind of historical solvent, dissolving questions before they harden into problems. And that may be one reason the Chicago mystery has remained half visible for so long. The standard narrative comes equipped with a built-in defense. Anything inconvenient gets absorbed into the roughness of early settlement life. But the excavations kept resisting that absorption. They resisted it through alignment, through preservation, through quality of construction, through repeated indications that the buried district was not just a pile of leftovers. Even the fill itself seems to resist it, in places behaving less like natural accumulation and more like intentional coverage. And that is the point where the story begins to feel bigger than local history. Because if one city's buried layer can be neutralized this way through practical work, simplified language, and a public appetite for clean beginnings, then the same mechanism could operate anywhere. How many old districts disappeared under regrading projects, widened roads, post-disaster rebuilding, or urban renewal before anyone thought to ask what exactly was being sealed away? How many cities solved engineering problems by burying evidence of earlier arrangements? How many official origin stories begin not with discovery, but with selective memory? Chicago is especially powerful because the burial occurred so close to living memory at the time. This was not ancient archaeology in the usual sense. Workers were not descending into some mythic lost civilization separated from them by thousands of years. They were uncovering a prior urban layer beneath the very city they thought they knew, and in some cases it seemed so intact, so structurally coherent that the gap between past and present must have felt disturbingly thin. That closeness may have made the discoveries more threatening, not less. Ancient ruins are romantic. A buried city just beneath your own streets is destabilizing. It suggests discontinuity where there should have been continuity. It suggests forgetting where there should have been memory. It suggests that a city can overwrite itself so completely that even within a generation, what once stood below can be reclassified as inconvenience instead of history. And that may be why the 1874 story remains so compelling to modern audiences. It speaks to a fear most cities quietly carry, that the surface story is not the whole story. That below the asphalt, the foundations, and the civic myths, there may be evidence of interrupted timelines, abandoned chapters, and inherited spaces no one bothered to explain. Chicago's street raising project becomes more than an engineering achievement in that light. It becomes an accidental excavation of narrative itself. The city went down into its own ground expecting mud and found chronology. Then it paved over chronology and called it progress. Maybe that was unavoidable. Maybe any city under that kind of pressure would have done the same. Maybe the practical demands of public health and infrastructure genuinely outweighed historical curiosity. That is possible. But practical necessity does not erase the strangeness of what was found. It only explains why the findings did not get the attention they deserved. So when you walk through modern Chicago, if you know this story, the city begins to feel layered in a different way. Not just architecturally layered, but historically layered in a more unsettling sense. Beneath the famous streets, beneath the celebrated rise, beneath the narrative of frontier mud, transformed into urban greatness, there may be another city still holding its shape in darkness. A city not entirely lost, just denied the status of full acknowledgement. A city that briefly surfaced in 1874 when workers cut into the ground and realized the past below them was more complete than anyone had been prepared to admit. And if that is true even partially, then the biggest mystery is no longer what the workers found. The biggest mystery is why the city was so ready to stop looking. Maybe the answer is simple. Cities stop looking because looking is dangerous. Not dangerous in the dramatic sense, not in the way old adventure stories imagine. Hidden chambers and forbidden truths, but dangerous to timelines, to reputations, to the smooth confidence of official memory. The moment you admit that a major city may have been built over a buried urban layer that does not fit the accepted chronology you introduce, uncertainty into everything that comes after. Suddenly, the founding story is no longer a clean point of origin. Suddenly, progress begins to look less like creation and more like replacement. Suddenly, the city is not just something that rose, but something that inherited, covered, and forgot. That kind of uncertainty is hard for institutions to love. Chicago in the 1870s was not a place built to entertain historical doubt. It was a place built to project certainty. Certainty in engineering, certainty in growth, certainty in the future. It had to be. This was a city determined to outrun its own instability, a city whose relationship with the ground itself had always been uneasy. Muddy streets, foul drainage, shifting grades, and the constant embarrassment of being seen as a filthy, half-formed boomtown all pushed civic leaders toward one obsession: control the surface and the story will follow. The street raising project did exactly that. It changed the physical level of the city, but it also changed the psychological level. It gave Chicago a cleaner face, a more modern identity, and a visible symbol of mastery over nature and chaos. In that context, anything uncovered beneath the old grade that threatened to complicate the transformation was almost destined to be handled as an obstacle rather than a revelation. So the work continued. The jacks turned, the foundations rose, the fill went in, and under the practical rhythm of construction, the buried evidence receded from view. That receding matters because it was not the same as resolution. Nothing in the surviving record suggests that the strange buried architecture was ever fully explained. It was simply outpaced, covered by the next stage of work, pushed beneath the next layer of necessity. That is one of the most recognizable patterns in urban history. Not discovery followed by understanding, but discovery followed by pressure. Questions appear, but schedules are stronger. Curiosity opens, but budgets close it. The future has no patience for an inconvenient past. And still the details left behind refuse to go quiet. The refined stonework, the aligned commercial fronts, the preserved lower stories, the deep foundations built for permanence, the corridors and passages that seem to hint at prior systems of movement below the accepted grade, the unusually consistent depth of burial across different structures, the dense, deliberate-looking fill in places where natural accumulation should have been more chaotic. Each detail alone might be explainable, but together they create the kind of pattern that keeps history from settling, not enough to claim certainty, more than enough to resist dismissal. That tension is probably why the Chicago street raising story keeps reappearing in alternate historical discussions, urban mysteries, and archival deep dives. People sense that the official summary is too tidy for what the fragments suggest. They sense the imbalance between the strangeness of the visual and physical evidence and the flatness of the later explanation. And once you notice that imbalance, it is hard to stop noticing it. Why do the buried buildings look so complete? Why does the masonry look so considered? Why do the lower levels feel sealed rather than slowly ruined? Why does the documentation thin out exactly where the implications become most uncomfortable? Those questions linger because they point toward a larger historical blind spot. We tend to imagine cities as places with clear beginnings, founded here, expanded there, destroyed, rebuilt, modernized. But real cities are not that obedient. They are layered, discontinuous, self-erasing. They inherit forms they no longer remember. They build over mistakes, disasters, and entire previous layouts. They absorb older landscapes until those landscapes survive only as anomalies in basements, tunnels, excavation cuts, and forgotten photographs. Chicago may simply be one of the rare places where that process was exposed so dramatically that the fragments could not be completely smoothed away. And if so, then the buried city beneath Chicago is not just a local oddity, it becomes a kind of warning about how history disappears in modern environments. Not through fire alone, not through flood alone, but through improvement, through development, through the perfectly respectable act of solving one problem while burying another. When streets rise, old levels fall into silence. When a city modernizes, it often edits itself. The archive that matters most is not always on paper. Sometimes it is in the ground, and once the ground is closed again, memory has to survive without access to its own evidence. That may be why the surviving photographs feel so powerful. They are not polished historical exhibits, they are glimpses, interruptions, moments when the city's official surface broke open and another version of place appeared underneath. Workers standing where no one was supposed to linger, masonry lines emerging from darkness, openings and walls telling a story the reports would later soften. The images do not shout, they do not prove everything, but they preserve the exact thing official history often loses: first, the shock of encounter. And that shock still matters. Because if modern Chicago truly rests on top of a buried urban layer, more complex than the official story admits, then the city is not simply a monument to reinvention. It is also a monument to selective memory. The gleaming streets above become inseparable from the sealed streets below. Progress above depends on forgetting below. The city's elegance rests at least symbolically on an act of compression, historical as much as physical. That does not make Chicago fraudulent, it makes it human. Cities do this. Civilizations do this. They build narratives the same way they build roads, by leveling, aligning, covering, and making what came before serve what comes next. But every so often a construction trench opens wide enough to reveal the seams. And in 1874, Chicago may have revealed one of the biggest seams of all. For a brief moment, while the city lifted itself into its modern form, workers seemed to have uncovered evidence that the ground beneath downtown held the remains of an earlier and more established urban world than anyone had been prepared to acknowledge. Whether that world was an unrecognized phase of Chicago itself, the remains of a forgotten civic order, or the result of a burial event. Later, history refused to describe plainly. The implications were serious enough that the simplest response was also the fastest one. Seal it. Build over it. Move on. Leave the new city standing above the old question. And maybe that is why this story stays with people, because it leaves you with an image you cannot easily shake. Not the image of Chicago rising, but the image of Chicago standing on something it chose not to fully understand. An entire chapter of urban existence below the sidewalks, below the foundations, below the confidence of official history. A hidden layer, not erased, just pressed into darkness. So the next time someone tells the story of how Chicago raised its streets, pay attention to what is missing. Listen for the buried storefronts. Listen for the sealed corridors. Listen for the stonework that looked too refined for a frontier myth. Listen for the silence in the reports. Because sometimes the most important part of a city's history is the part it improved right out of sight. And beneath the traffic, beneath the towers, beneath the modern grid of one of America's greatest cities, the older question may still be there, unchanged and unanswered, waiting under layers of fill for someone to ask one more time what exactly was buried when Chicago decided to rise. And once you start asking that question seriously, Chicago stops looking like an isolated case and starts looking like a pattern waiting to be recognized elsewhere. Because the logic is not unique to one city. A disaster happens, or a redesign becomes necessary, or a major engineering project opens the ground. Workers find older layers, older structures, older systems that do not fit neatly into the polished story later generations prefer. And then the same forces appear every time. Deadlines, money, public image, civic momentum. The future pressing down harder than the past can push back. What gets exposed briefly is documented just enough to keep the machinery moving, then absorbed beneath the next phase of construction. The city survives, the narrative survives, the anomaly does not. Chicago just happened to leave behind enough fragments for the pattern to remain visible. That is why the 1874 street raising still carries such a strange charge. On the surface, it is one of the great civic engineering stories of 19th century America. A muddy, flood-prone city lifted itself into a more sanitary future. Streets rose, buildings adapted, commerce continued, progress won. That story is real. But below it sits another story, quieter and more disturbing. A story about excavations that expose something older than expected, better built than expected, more coherent than expected, and then sealed it away before those implications could settle into public memory. And maybe that is the detail that matters most. Not whether every interpretation attached to the buried Chicago story is correct. Not whether every surviving photograph proves exactly what later speculation wants it to prove. The deepest issue is simpler than that. Something beneath the city did not fit the official timeline cleanly, and instead of becoming the beginning of a bigger investigation, it became part of the ground plan. That is what gives the whole story its unsettling power. Because once evidence is sealed beneath a living city, it becomes incredibly difficult to challenge the story above it. The surface takes authority. Streets, sidewalks, later foundations, later archives, later textbooks, later confidence. The buried layer becomes physically inaccessible and therefore intellectually easier to downgrade. Historians inherit incomplete records. Researchers inherit scattered photographs. The public inherits a simplified version of events. And with every passing decade, the buried city becomes easier to call a misunderstanding, a curiosity, or an exaggeration, precisely because the evidence that might have clarified it now sits under tons of later construction. It is a perfect historical trap. What is covered becomes doubtful because it is covered. And it stays covered because it is doubtful. That circular logic protects official stories far more effectively than any dramatic conspiracy ever could. So when people ask why the buried Chicago discoveries never changed the standard narrative, the answer may be that the street raising itself made sure they would not. The moment the new grade went in, the city acquired a new physical truth and a new historical one. Whatever older layer had surfaced in the excavations was now literally under the approved version of Chicago. The elevated streets became not just infrastructure but a lid over earlier storefronts, earlier entrances, earlier passages, earlier foundations, earlier questions. And what survives above ground now is mostly implication. Implication in the photographs, implication in the worker accounts, implication in the odd phrasing of internal notes, implication in the mismatch between the sophistication of the buried architecture and the roughness of the accepted frontier myth, implication in the near uniform depth of burial, implication in the preserved lower stories that seem less like decay and more like interruption, implication in the passages and tunnels that appear too early, implication in the clean, dense fill that sometimes feels more deliberate than natural. None of that forces a single grand conclusion, but all of it points in the same direction. The city beneath Chicago, or at least parts of it, appears to have been more substantial, more organized, and more abruptly removed from view than the standard explanation comfortably accounts for. And if that is true, even in a limited way, then the real mystery of 1874 is not what workers found. The real mystery is what kind of historical world allows something like that to be found and then treated as secondary. What kind of culture looks at buried commercial fronts, refined masonry, deep foundations, preserved spaces, and below-grade infrastructure, then shrugs and says the road has to be finished? Probably the same kind of culture that builds modern cities everywhere. That may be the final lesson hidden inside the Chicago story. Not that one city secretly sits on a lost civilization in the most sensational sense, but that urban history is always more fragile than official memory pretends. Cities are not just built, they are edited. They are revised physically, then explained retrospectively. Whole layers of experience can vanish when a new grade is established, when a post-disaster rebuild begins, when utility demands outrun curiosity. By the time later generations arrive, the visible city feels complete, and the buried city feels optional. But the buried city may be the more honest one, because it still carries the interruptions. It still carries the transitions. It still carries the evidence of what the surface tried to simplify. Chicago's raised streets solved a practical problem. They improved sanitation. They helped create the modern city. None of that has to be denied. But they may also have done something else at the exact same time. They may have formalized forgetting. They may have taken a deeply inconvenient layer of urban history and pressed it permanently below the threshold of everyday awareness. The future was built, the past was compacted, the official story got cleaner because the ground underneath it became less accessible. And maybe that is why the idea of buried cities fascinates people so deeply now. Not because everyone believes every mystery attached to them, but because the image feels true in a larger sense. Beneath every polished narrative, there is often a compressed layer of uncertainty. Beneath every modern city, there are choices about what was preserved, what was ignored, and what was useful to forget. Chicago simply gives that abstract truth a physical form. A city that literally raised itself while lowering part of its own story into darkness. So if you step back and look at the 1874 street raising one last time, the project becomes two things at once. It is an engineering triumph, and it is a burial, a modernization of the visible city and a sealing of the hidden one, a civic solution above ground and a historical question below it. For a brief moment, workers cut into downtown Chicago and saw evidence that the city's origins might be older, stranger, and more layered than the official version ever admitted. Then the trenches closed, the grade rose, and the mystery was locked under the very success story that replaced it. And that is what makes the story linger, because the evidence was not destroyed in some dramatic blaze or washed away in legend. It was simply built over, folded into the city, made part of the foundation, turned from revelation into substructure. Still there, perhaps. Still intact in places, perhaps. Still waiting under modern streets, perhaps. Which leaves you with the question the official narrative never quite answers. When Chicago raised itself in 1874, what exactly did it leave beneath its feet? And if one of America's greatest cities could stand so comfortably over a buried chapter of its own past, how many other cities are doing the same thing right now? Their real histories sleeping just below the pavement, sealed in darkness, hidden not by time alone, but by the simple, efficient act of moving on.